Well, today we're going to talk about an odd piece of GM station wagon trivia, and that is what in the world is going on with these little notches in the rear bumpers of these wagons. Can you guess what it is before I tell you? Well, if you said that that was a provision for a step when the door opened, you would be correct. Ding, 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 ding. In fact, General Motors was apparently so impressed by this invention and thought it was unique and novel enough to market to customers that they put on the cover of this 1969 Chevrolet wagon brochure. Kind of an odd way to showcase your wagon. Normally, you would show the front of the vehicle, not the rear. But you can see here with the door open, the little notch for the step in the bumper comes with the door. Just kind of tags along with it for the ride. And that way you can step on the bumper and into the rear of your wagon. Now, perhaps this is on the 1969 Chevrolet Wagons brochure, because 1969 was the first year in which this appeared on General Motors wagons, despite the fact that 1969 really wasn't a novel year for introducing all new full-size cars that would happen in 1965 and 1970. Nor was it the year in which intermediate cars would be all new. That would have happened in 1968 and 1973. So interesting that General Motors elected not only to introduce this as a running change to existing models, but also that they elected to make this change not only to full-size wagons like what you see here, the Chevrolet Kingwood Estate, but also to the intermediate-size wagons. Now, you only receive this notch in your bumper if you had the optional third-row seat in your General Motors wagon, because otherwise there would be no reason to have this step to climb into the back seat. So, that's one way that you can tell a wagon that has the rearmost seat from one that does not. Now, as I was mentioning, this was introduced in 1969 on the full-size and intermediate wagons. And as a consequence, it would continue only for one additional model year on the full-size wagons, 1970, before 1971. The General Motors clamshell wagons were introduced, and this notch would be gone because on the clamshells, there was no swinging door that opened. There was only I guess we'll call it a tailgate, or a door that dropped below the loading floor along with the glass that went up into the roof panel. So there was no need, I guess, for a step, or, perhaps they could have just had a cutout in the bumper, but that would have looked rather odd. There was no way to kind of disguise the step quite readily. And also on the clamshell wagons, you didn't enter the rear seat from the rear of the wagon. You would get in the rear seat from the rear doors on the passenger side, or the rear door on the passenger side, because the third row faced forward in those clamshell wagons as opposed to facing rearward. So there was really no reason for you to step into that rear, unless I guess you had some cargo that was very far forward. Now, when it came to the intermediate-sized wagons, the intermediate cars would be redone for the 1973 model year. And so, the intermediate wagons all the way through 1972, like you see here, this Chevrolet SS wagon, as it's labeled, has that little notch in the bumper for the entry into the rear seat area. So, again, this would continue on to the 1973 model year, at which point the wagon was redesigned. You can see here a 1973 Chevrolet SS wagon. By the way, this is a factory Chevrolet SS wagon for 1973. And I think it's one of about 80 that were produced that came standard with the 454 cubic inch big block V8. And this particular wagon that was new for 1973 had a clamshell, but a different design. You notice the handle here. The liftgate opens all the way. There's not a separate glass and lower portion. You just kind of open the entire liftgate. And that was how you got into your wagon. So, I guess Chevrolet and the other General Motors divisions just felt that that step wasn't needed because in this case, the rear seats did face rearward just like the previous generation, and unlike the full-size clamshell wagons. So, you could have used a step. Maybe it was a cost-saving move, but GM, like I said, also introduced a different door. And maybe that would be weird to have the little notch cut out of for the step raise up with the liftgate. It might kind of whack you in the face if you're not too careful, since it would have protruded from the liftgate area. In any case, I thought I'd share this interesting tidbit of General Motors wagon history because not many people know about it since it was only around on the full-size wagons in 1969 and 1970 and on the intermediates in 1969 through 1972, and then it was kind of gone. I don't know of any other wagon that I can think of, at least of domestic vehicles, that has this despite the fact that many have rear-facing rear seats. Now, these wagons, I will say, just on another note, are, I think, super cool. And probably my favorites are the clamshells and the full-size wagons that predate the clamshells, like this particular Chevrolet Kingwood Estate. They're pretty awesome. They're well-equipped. They're well-trimmed. They have big, powerful V8s. And this will be the last of, I think, the real true wagon era. These full-size wagons, not only through the 1970 model year, when the notch stopped on the full-size wagons, but really the clamshells that stopped after the 1976 model year. And why do I say that? Well, after that point, you really couldn't get a big block engine in a General Motors wagon. You go over at Ford still, but for the General Motors wagons, once they downsized in 1977, there were no more big block V8 engines that were placed in these wagons. And I think that a true wagon has to have a big block. I mean, that's how you can tow 6,000 pounds plus. In some cases, Chryslers, you could even tow 7,000 pounds with your wagon despite the fact that they were unibody. And you get some decent scoot out of them. They kind of move quite well. Whereas after that point, and I would say particularly by the time you get into the early 1980s and mid-1980s, you just don't have big engines anymore. And so the biggest engine in a lot of wagons for GM in that 80s era was the old 307. And I've driven wagons with it. It's just not quite enough power when you're used to the big block and the torque of the big block. The old 307, it just doesn't do, especially with all the heaviness of the wagons, given that they have this glass area and the glass takes or creates a lot of weight for the vehicles. And I will say that my vote for the most outrageous wagon ever has to be this 1970 Pontiac Safari wagon. I mean, look at that front nose and how much bright work there is, especially that bird beak and this big chrome grille and the headlamps, as well as what was supposed to look like outlets for horn sounds inboard of those headlamps. It's just over the top in a very kit way. And people are going to say that I don't necessarily want to own one of these 1970 Pontiacs. No, I would. I think they're great cars. They drive well. You got the premium fuel 455 cubic inch V8 underhood in the big full-size Pontiacs, at least a lot of them of the era. Of course, I would take one of these. I just don't know if I want to be seen driving around in it. But I would enjoy driving it because they are really a sublime ride. I would say, though, that they are the wagons of the 1965 to 1970 General Motors generation ride a little bit better than the clamshells. The clamshells went to leaf springs in the rear. Previous generation had coil springs, and the leaf springs made sense if you were towing or you were loading the wagon up a lot because they enable less deflection than the coil springs. But they also didn't endow the vehicles with as good a ride as the previous generation. So, just something that you want to keep in mind if you're looking for one of these wagons. But you know what? Any of them really are great. They're kind of fun to have, and there aren't many left. So, if you find one in good shape at a good price, I would definitely pick it up. What do you think about that little step in the notch? Was that worth retooling bumpers and doing all that work just for that brief run? Put a comment in the comment section and let me know. Thanks again for watching.